Welcome everyone to today's program, which is sponsored by the Plant Initiative. The Seed Keeper, a conversation with author Diane Wilson. I'm Paul Moss, the Executive Director of the Plant Initiative, and I'm really excited to introduce Diane Wilson and to start off our 1-hour program, which will be co-moderated by Keith Williams and me. Diane Wilson is a Dakota author, educator, and bog steward who has published 5 award-winning books as well as numerous essays. Her novel, The Seed Keeper, received the 2022 Minnesota Book Award for fiction. Diane's essays have been featured in many publications, and she has received numerous grants, including a 2013 Bush Fellowship and the 2018 AARP Pollen 50 over 50 Community Leadership Award. Diane is the former executive director for Dream of Wild Health, an indigenous nonprofit farm, and also the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance, a national coalition of tribes and organizations working to create sovereign food systems for Native people. She is an enrolled member of the Rosebud Reservation in South Dakota. Diane is a gardener living on 10 acres north of the Twin Cities here in Minnesota. Co-moderator Keith Williams is an assistant professor in the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies at Athabasca University. His work focuses on better understanding how to be good relations with our more than human kin, particularly plants and fungi. Keith draws heavily on post-human philosophy, indigenous thought, and his lived experience with family members, human and otherwise. And Keith is a board member of the Plant Initiative. So the first half hour will include a conversation between Diane, Keith, and me. Then for the remainder of the program, Diane will be responding to questions posed by you, the attendees, that will be presented to Diane by Keith or me as selected from questions that are posted in the Zoom chat. So we encourage you to please suggest a question for Diane by posting it in the chat, which you can see at the bottom of your screen. The program is being recorded and it will be posted online on the Plant Initiative's YouTube channel, and a link to the recording will be sent to everyone who registered. With that, I'm turning over the program to Keith.
Thank you, Paul, and greetings, everyone. I'd like to take a moment to do a kind of opening prayer or land acknowledgement. I'd like to say that I have one foot in the land of the Dawn in Mi'kma'ki, also known as Nova Scotia, the unceded and ancestral land of the Mi'kmaq people, and the other foot on the western side of the eastern door under the rafters of the Longhouse, encompassing the Dish with One Spoon territory, the Great Lakes region. As winter slowly arrives, our seasonal rhythms change from the busyness of autumn, from gathering mushrooms, saving seed, and stacking wood to the quietude of winter. I appreciate the blanket of snow that hushes the land and hushes our routines. I'd like us all to take a moment to consider the seeds that lie dormant, the seeds of our ancestors, whether we are indigenous or if we have left our original homelands, or both. Like us, these seeds carry the blood memory of all those who came before us, and through them we can all rediscover what we have lost through colonization, capitalism, other manifestations of acculturation, and the tragedy of indifference. Thank you, everyone, for being here, and thank you so much, Diane, for writing this masterful and moving novel and talking with us about it today. With that, Paul will ask the first question.
Great. Thanks so much, Keith. This is a basic question is just how did you come to write The Seed Keeper and to create its wonderful characters?
Well, first of all, hamatakiapi, Diane Wilson amakiapia, bide wakantuan o yate hamatahaya, si changu o yate ed omawapia. I want to greet all my relatives here today. And my name's Diane Wilson. I'm a descendant of the Bide Wakantuan Oyate here in Minnesota, and I'm enrolled on the Rosebud Reservation. And we always like to start our meetings with the introduction in Dakota. And I just wanted to mention too that I am speaking to you all today from Dakota homeland in Minnesota. And I want to express my deep appreciation and gratitude to the Plant Initiative for the invitation to be here. So, back to your question, how did I come to write the book? Good question. Um, I would say back in about the year 2000, I was working on what was my first book, and that was a memoir about my mother's family, trying to understand my mother's life because she was also enrolled on the Rosebud Reservation, and she grew up in boarding schools, and so my memoir was trying to understand about cultural identity and assimilation. But I'm also a gardener. So back then I heard about these old seeds that were being grown out at this tiny little garden called Dream of Wild Health. And it was one of those moments where I just knew that I had to show up and be part of the work with those seeds. And when I think about it now, I really believe that the seeds were calling us to the work. And so I got involved with Dream of Wild Health first as a gardener, and then I went to work for them in 2008 as their director. And it was that experience of working there for many years, having the opportunity to work with elders, with farmers, with Native families and youth and the seeds themselves, that really, I have to say, I have to use this metaphor, planted the seed for this book that I hadn't started out thinking of it as a novel, but as I finished what would become my first two books, I realized that returning to our indigenous foods and taking care of our seeds and our land is really central to our culture. And that is and that the teachings that I was learning being part of that farm were so important that it became the basis for writing the novel. So really, this novel, even though it's a fictional story, it is based on what I learned firsthand working at that farm. And so the characters themselves have some connection to some of the people that I met along the way. I would be inspired by people who were doing different kinds of work, and then I would expand that into a character. So it was it was a long road for me to first learn an entirely different way, an entirely different relationship about being with our seeds and our foods.
Wow, thank you. Thank you. Keith, you want to ask the next question?
Sure. Diane, you write about some very difficult and emotionally charged topics. And to be honest, I had to put the book down a few times while reading it. But yet, the sensitivity and the tenderness that you bring to your writing is like a gentle entry to opening up our hearts to considering or feeling into these fraught histories. I guess, I wonder, how did you do this? And did you have to write and rewrite with this intention, or did it just naturally emerge from your writing process?
Well, I do think that writing is really mostly rewriting, that in that first draft you get the bones of it. Maybe you get basic story, but especially for stories that are difficult, that are traumatic, that carry pain and sorrow, that you have to be very, very careful with those. And I really try to approach my writing as a spiritual practice, so that if I know that I'm going to write a scene, for example, that's going to touch on a part of history that I know was difficult, very there's a scene from boarding school era, for example, then I'm very careful about the way that I approach that, both in terms of what I'm writing about and how that story might impact readers, but also the way that when we enter into those traumatic stories through our imagination, you can also traumatize yourself. So it's a very careful process, but it was really important to me to be a witness to all aspects of the story, not just the trauma, but also the depth and the brilliance of our cultures that allowed people to survive to today. So it hopefully comes across as a story that reflects on all aspects of what this story means, not just the hard parts and the difficult history, but also how the beauty of working with seeds, for example, and the way that our spirituality has always been a critically important part of um, not just surviving, but in living every day and appreciating everyone around us.
Thank you. Next question is, what are some of the important messages that you hope that readers will take from reading the book?
So one of the, when I was working with Dream of Wild Health all those years, and we would talk a lot about our relationship with seeds and our responsibility towards them, and some of the teachings that are really important in our communities, because we were intertribal. So the conversation was often across tribal lines, and we were looking for what are the teachings that we all share in common. And one of them is Mitakuye Owashi, which is the teaching that we are all related. And that's fundamental to what it means to be a Dakota person, that you are, first of all, is supposed to be a good relative, not only to each other as human beings, but also to everyone around you, your water, your soil, your seeds. And that when I was thinking about the book, even though I needed to include GMO seeds as an important part of the story, I didn't want to get caught up in a politicized debate around the science of GMO seeds, because that's a very polarizing conversation. So really what I was trying to do in the book was to ask the question about our relationship with seeds and how it's changed over generations, and what that change means for us as human beings, but also for the seeds. And so that's why I go back in time to 1862 and show how Dakota women took care of their seeds back then, and then to follow the story of those seeds all the way to 2002 and say, oh, this is what we're doing now. This is the choices we've made around using genetically modified seeds, and look at that relationship. And is that what's best for seeds? I mean, I know we're so human-centric often that we look at everything in terms of what benefits human beings, but what is best for the seeds themselves? So I think I mentioned to you that, Paul, that I wanted to read a single paragraph from the book.
Great,
And
great.
this is just, it kind of sums up what I think about seeds, as said by, this was spoken by the main character, Rosie Ironwing, and she didn't know how to garden. She's lost her connection to her community. She doesn't have a family. And so she starts to garden. And this is what she begins to understand about seeds. Everywhere I looked, I saw how seeds were holding the world together. They planted forests, covered meadows with wildflowers, sprouted in the cracks of sidewalks, or lay dormant until the long-awaited moment came, signaled by fire or rain or warmth. They filled the produce aisle in grocery stores. Seeds breathed and spoke in a language all their own. Each one was a miniature time capsule, capturing years of stories in its tender flesh. How ignorant I felt compared to the brilliance contained in a single seed. I had begun to see that when we save these seeds, when we select which ones will be planted again, our lives become braided into the life stories of these plants.
That's beautiful. Thank
So
you.
that's the book in a paragraph.
Thank you. Keith?
So, Diane, I see your book as a kind of fine woven basket with multiple overlapping and intersecting themes, such as cultural loss and recovery, intergenerational trauma, historic representation, plant personhood, and much more. I'm very curious, in what other ways have you explored these themes? And how have these experiences in other domains of life, including other forms of artistic expression, informed your writing practice?
You know, that I'm interested. I'm glad to hear you ask this question, because it wasn't an ambitious story to try to tell, and it does have themes that were so important to me from the work that I've done as a gardener and as a writer. And, you know, maybe the overarching theme of what I've been trying to do in all of my writing is the work of cultural recovery. And to me, food is one of the most important ways that we do that. And it's also one of the most joyful. So sometimes when we're talking about traumatic history, that we tell these stories, we remember this history, but we also have to remember to find joy. And so one of those ways for me is through gardening, because it's that connection with seeds that grounds me literally in the work of the work that is experiential. So that, you know, it was very gratifying to write the story, but I needed to make sure that I always stayed in touch with what it meant to me to be a seed keeper. That in my own garden, that I could grow out the three sisters. And the corn that I write about in the book is actually the corn that I grow in my garden. That was part of there was in 1862, the Dakota people were removed. And so there is a story about how when the Dakota people were removed from the state following the war. So 1,700 Dakota women, children, and elders were rounded up, forced marched to a concentration camp at Fort Snelling, and then completely removed from the state. And they didn't know where they were going. And so the story that I was told is that the women, they hid their seeds in their pockets and they sewed them into the hems of their skirts. And so I heard that story when in 2002, when I participated in the Dakota Commemorative March. And it was in that moment that I realized that even when families were starving during that removal, that these women protected those seeds. And because they knew that they would need something to plant in the coming season, and they would need these seeds for future generations. And that was the story that really brought home to me what it means to protect those seeds, and how deep our responsibility goes in terms of making sure that the seeds survive. And so, so some of the ways that I try to explore what I'm writing is through gardening, but also through participating in my community and being part of events like the Dakota Commemorative March. But I've actually seen a huge transformation in the past 20 years around returning to our indigenous foods in our communities. So that's very heartening. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. You know, you've already answered one of the questions I was going to ask next. So how about it, Keith, if you want to skip to your next question about the gardening?
Sure, Paul. And actually, Diane, you You know, you partially answered this already as well. So gardening with traditional indigenous varieties, especially the Three Sisters, corn, beans, and squash, is a path towards decolonization and reclamation of what was lost or taken away. In reading your novel, it's very clear that you have a lot of gardening experience, and I wonder, can you tell us a bit about those personal gardening experiences, specifically with traditional varieties?
Well, I consider myself still a learner, definitely a learner in the gardening world. But I was, and maybe one of the reasons why I'm always learning and still consider myself, maybe always to be a beginner, is I'm so fascinated by the stories of the seeds. So that I can get distracted. But it has always been important to me to be in relationship with plants. And one of the ways is to grow the Three Sisters garden from seeds that were given to me from Dream of Wild Health. And I grow those plants in my garden. So that corn, as I said earlier, is the corn that I tell the story of in the book. And that's a way for me to really be connected in knowing that even though that book is fiction, the characters are fictional, that history is true. And I think the truth of the story comes through that experience with actually working with plants themselves. But I'm also fascinated by our perennial pollinator plants. That's another big passion of I want I like to work with these old seeds, but I also really love having a habitat for pollinators. And then as Keith and I were discussing before we got started, I also live with a tamarack bog. And that to me is a place of endless fascination. So these plants each require a little different relationship. So with our seeds, we are collaborators. We work together on making sure they have what they need, from soil and water to the place to being harvested at the right time. Pollinator plants, maybe my role is to expand them or plant them or move them around sometimes. The bog, my role is to leave her alone. She is a stable, healthy community at the moment, has no need of any human involvement. And so that to me is one of the interesting questions around plants, is what is the appropriate relationship at the right time?
Thank you, Diane, for your thoughtful response.
And if there's
Um,
anything you want to add about bogs, Keith, you just
I love bogs, definitely the source. I'll,
this kind of ties in a little bit with what you were just saying, but it's just on that whole theme of respect for plants. And as you know, that plant initiative, we're working to increase respect for plants. And what does increasing respect for plants mean to you? If you might have anything else you want to add to that.
well, I think about the way that we understand the world and in terms of the hierarchy of beings, and that in a Western model, I would say it's probably more common to think about humans as being the dominant species and that everyone else serves human needs. Whereas in indigenous thought, humans are actually the lowest because we're the most dependent and we are the least advanced. So really getting to know plants and how sophisticated they are. And then the same with animals and the way in which their reality is far less dependent for the survival on us than we are on them. And so to me, what respect means is to really come to this work with humility and to understand how much as human beings we have to learn. I mean, just look at the state we've created around the planet. And that is a misunderstanding of how we live in a sustainable way. And this is this is not true of all cultures either, but it is where we've gotten to at this time. But if we look back to plants, then, and to see how they evolve and how generously they share themselves so that we can survive, then you know, to me, that the appropriate response and relationship is one of humility and respect and gratitude. And so that we're always in appreciation for plants and our seeds, for the fact that our lives depend on those relationships.
Oh, thank you. That's really wonderful. Thank you.
So, plant personhood figures prominently throughout your novel. In the opening prayer or poem at the beginning of the book, you write, "We remember when all of the world had its own song. To know that song was to speak to all beings in their own language. Many indigenous cultures of Turtle Island refer to the time when animals and plants could speak, or perhaps more accurately, when we could hear them. Is there any hope for humanity to relearn or remember that universal language?"
Boy, that's that. You know, I think because I don't know what that language was that was ancestral, but what I can say from my own experience now is that plants are speaking to us all the time, that their language is not verbal, and that when we take the time to really observe, then you begin to see what that language is of movement and color and sound and abundance. So we know a plant is healthy and happy when it is flourishing, when the leaves are a deep color, when it's if it's a food crop, for example, that if it's a tomato, it has a lot of fruit and it's not suffering from pests. Then, so to me, this is all part of the language of plants right now, and trying to understand what need, what intention, what desire is that plant expressing through his or her or their behavior. And that is again, it's that practice of humility and patience and trusting your intuition. You know, I have a sense sometimes when I walk by certain plants that there are plants in my garden that they're gregarious. Like they like to be by the sidewalk. They want to interact. And there are other plants that would kind of like to be further away. You know, they just want to do their thing. And so I try to pay attention to that and just, you know, try to, in my very small way, understand plant language and how what I am providing is working with them or not working with them. So, you know, and that's the gift, because when you're out, as gardeners, we all know the joy of being outside in your garden in those quiet moments when you're weeding and you can feel that plant just feel good because, oh, my roots are no longer entangled with these other competing plants. And yeah, so to me, that's the language of plants that that gardeners intuitively understand.
Thank you.
Keith and I are just going to ask another couple questions and then we'll turn it over to all of you. So please continue to post your questions. I can see there's some really nice, interesting questions already. So please feel free to do that. Okay, so my last question will be, in what way do you think that plants want to share themselves with humans, and why are they so generous to humans with their lives and bodies? Why do you think?
So the book opens with a poem that is actually the seeds themselves speaking. So I wanted to show the seeds as a being who was, because they open and close the book, they're actually observing human beings as how we are how, in terms of our relationship with seeds. And part of that poem is to share this understanding that thousands of years ago, there was an original agreement with seeds, between seeds and human beings. And it's also with water and human beings, that we take care of our seeds and our seeds take care of us. And this is the teaching of reciprocity. And so if we're upholding that original agreement, then it means we're taking care of those seeds in the way that they need, meaning healthy soil, clean water, harvested at the right time, and stored in the way they need to be stored. And when we take care of them in the way that they need, then they take care of us by providing food and making sure that there's more food for the coming seasons. So they help us survive. And so it's a very mutually supportive relationship, and that is that profoundly important teaching of reciprocity, that everything depends on that teaching of reciprocity. So plants are generous to us because of that agreement, but in turn, we carry a deep responsibility to be equally generous back to plants. And so that, to me, this is our reciprocal relationship that we're trying to honor. And what I see in the work of the Plant Initiative is really to call attention back to those original relationships, and to make sure that as human beings, we are continuing to carry the responsibility that we have had for thousands of years, because our survival depends on the generosity of plants and animals.
Thank you. Keith, do you either want to ask your question, or do you want to go with one of the first ones from the chat?
Well, you know, it is half past, so maybe we should, I mean, I do have one more to ask, but we can.
Go
maybe
ahead,
we
Keith.
could-
Ask your last question.
Are
That's
you
fine.
sure?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so Diane, the relationship between the two main characters, John, a white farmer, and Rosalie, a Dakota woman who grew up gathering and gardening, is very interesting. Barely visible at the edge of their relationship is the implied suggestion that there may have been a point prior to the advent of industrial agriculture in which indigenous peoples and European settlers might have charted a radically different shared path. Outside of contemporary industrial agriculture, do you see room for meaningful and productive conversations between alternative small-scale ecological farming and indigenous approaches to the land?
Oh, yeah. Yes, definitely. To me, that's one of the most hopeful directions we can go with our food and our food systems. And in the story, the reason I had Rosalie first begin planting seeds was with John's mother, Edna, who was also a seed keeper. And so the whole intention of that part of the story was to show our commons, to show that it's indigenous people have been seed keepers for thousands of years, but so were many European settlers, that they brought seeds from their home countries. And there are stories of women on slave ships hiding seeds in their hair. There are stories of Hmong story cloths that have seeds woven into them. And so seeds are actually a great commons for most of our, well, I should say many of our communities, that we have these long traditions of keeping our seeds. And that is really what I would hope that we come back to, is that we share this work. This isn't just indigenous seeds are heirloom seeds that have been held and protected by Native families for generations, but heirloom seeds, our family seeds, our community seeds, they all need to be protected. And when we're doing this work all together, that's when we really start to make change.
I agree, and that is such a hopeful perspective. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's actually a perfect lead into the first question that was asked. Is it okay if I read that, Paul?
Yeah, great.
Okay, so let's see here. So Jill asked a great question, and that's, love the idea so much that seeds and food hold stories. What do you see as the relation of seeds and food to oral stories and storytelling?
So that's a great question. And maybe I can give a story, an example. When this book came out, and this was during the pandemic, so we had to do everything online. But what we decided to do, I worked with different community organizations, and we hosted a seed week. And the first night of Seed Week was traditional storytellers. So we had a Lakota, Ojibwe, and a Dakota storytellers who all brought forward and shared the old stories that talk about our relationship to seeds and our foods, and also what our responsibility is. So they're told in the ways that these old stories are. You know, you have to think them through. But it was really important to us to start that week by establishing that the oral stories as the foundation for our knowledge and our teachings around how we're supposed to behave with relationship to our seeds and our foods. And then the second night was what I call contemporary storytelling. So it was my book, and it was two other writers. And our stories were looking at, so how are we doing in relation to the teachings in those oral stories? How are we upholding the teachings that our ancestors left for us? And so that is how I think about my own work. And then the other nights had a gardener talking about seeds, and we had youth doing a food cooking workshop. And then we had Keith Secola, a musician, who was talking about his seed rock opera. So, you know, seeds can go everywhere, but the foundation to these teachings around seeds is the oral stories.
Thank you. The next question is from Sharon, and it's really about the book. And she's asking, if a part 2 of The Seed Keeper exists in your imagination, what will happen with Rosalie's relationship with her son?
Good question. And yes, there is one in my imagination. And in that book, I'm really curious about Thomas and Mato, the two young men. And I'm, you know, because I would say the question I am most often asked is, what did Thomas decide to do at the end of the book with the seeds he was given? And there's no answer. So I'm interested in exploring that. And I'm sure as part of that, I would have to think, I mean, I think the relationship between Rosalie and Thomas has everything to do with his understanding of who he is, having grown up in a mixed family, and that he has to really decide how he's going to be in the world as an indigenous person or as a white farmer. So, you know, these are big decisions he's facing.
Thank you. Keith, you want to do the next one?
Sure. Yeah, thanks. Sorry, it just took me a minute to unmute. So Bara asks, what examples might you give for ways, projects, programs that you've seen or participated in to raise awareness of our interrelatedness with our non-human relatives? And you talked a little bit about a seed week.
Mhm.
Is there anything you'd like to add to that, or more that you'd like to share around that idea?
Well, I think the work of organizations like Dream of Wild Health, for example, are doing a terrific job of not only stewarding the seeds and protecting them and growing them out so they return to their communities, but they're also teaching our youth. So they're passing on this information, because intergenerational teaching is critically important to doing this work and has always been part of our communities. Native American Food Sovereignty also does a lot of education work. Seed Savers in Iowa to me is a great resource for finding seeds and actually visiting their big farm to see the work that they're doing. I think Sean Sherman in his, for those of you who don't know Sean Sherman, he is a Lakota chef. And I actually knew him when I was working at Dream of Wild Health, and he was on my board. So he went on to become this world famous, incredibly successful native chef. And he has elevated the whole idea and understanding of native foods as cuisine. So he now, he established the Owamini, which is an indigenous restaurant that only serves indigenous foods. So there's no white flour, there's no dairy, there's no sugar, and the foods are amazing. So, and there are small programs like that popping up all over the place. Those are, you know, just a few that are, that I've worked with most often. But what I see is this tremendous momentum around reclaiming our food and our food systems in general. Because I think we're really beginning to understand that it's not only critically important for the health of our land, but it's also important for our own health and the health of our communities. So those are just a couple of places to look at, and then they'll lead you on, you know, the wild rabbit hole that Google can be.
Thanks. Next is a kind of a longer comment and question, but I'm going to read it all. It's from Janet Sturck. I love the idea of keeping the seeds as metaphor for keeping the wisdom of the generations that have come before us. But I am also so inspired to keep keeping the seeds myself. Um, I have planted prairie grasses and flowers in areas that were formerly grass from seed that my brother-in-law has kept and saved. Now it's my turn to save my seeds. What is the best way to save them, and when to harvest? Next spring? How can I continue to learn how to keep this going? What is the appropriate relationship to have with my grasses and flowers? I wish I had enough sun and growing season for vegetables. I am on the south shore of Lake Superior near the Red Cliff Tribe. There's a lot in the question, but anything that resonates with you that you'd want to share?
Well, I'm hearing a seed keeper in there. And boy, I think especially since we're heading into this is certainly a time when you can still gather seeds, but since every plant is specific, then I would say this is a really great time to get some resources, books about seed keeping, and then also look for classes. Because you know, I think it's really important to understand the needs of your specific plants, because there are plants that seeds need cold. There are plants that seeds need to be stored, and you know, your garden seeds, for example, those have to be stored in dark, dry, cool conditions. Other plants, wild plants, might need to be scattered in the winter to make sure that they have that cold stratification period. So it can't be a one answer fits all, but I'm excited that you're excited about saving seeds. And I encourage you to just start learning. And there's groups out there, there's places you can go, there's great books. You know, just yeah, just get started. Start with get your library.
Thank you.
Dan, the next question is from Julie. And Julie says, my daughter has started to re-indigenize our yard with pollinator plants and beginning gardens. What advice or direction can you suggest to be able to provide resource for urban settings? We are little shell Chippewa living far from our ancestral lands. Much love and respect for your journey.
Oh, that makes me so happy to hear. You know, and it's a great reminder that no matter where you live, you can be in relationship with plants. You just work with what you've got. even sometimes if it's only a container on your patio. But for urban settings, again, I think a lot of gardening to me is that process of getting acquainted with the plants that you're really wanting to grow. And so it may be that you have to experiment a bit with the seeds that are going to do best in your yard. And you didn't mention really if you're doing vegetables, or, you have to look at your conditions. Try beans are easy. The beans, if you want to grow indigenous seeds, the beans are probably the easiest to start with. They do require sun. Any vegetable plant is going to require a lot of sun. If you don't have a sunny yard, then you can look at some of the other, maybe there's some medicine plants that will do well. But just the biggest advice I would give is be patient with yourself and allow yourself to explore and learn. And if a plant doesn't work out, or you can't keep it alive, you give thanks to that plant for their life, and then you return them to the soil. So it's a cycle that keeps giving. And there is a book that I don't know if it will be specifically helpful to urban gardens, but it is the last name is Genius, Geniu SZ. And the title is something like plants have everything to tell us, we just have to ask. So it's something along those lines. But I would just encourage you to stay on that learning path. That's what we're all doing in reclaiming this knowledge, is allowing ourselves to be learners and to get reacquainted with plants. And it's slow work.
Great. Next question, I'm skipping over some comments, but the next question is, are there plants considered to be sacred to the Dakota people? Thank you. From Linda Nelson.
There are 4 plants that are considered to be medicine plants, and that's our cedar, our tobacco, our sweetgrass, and sage. And so those are plants that are often offered with prayers, or they're used in ceremonies. And so that's there's so much more that could be said about that, but those are the four that I know of for Dakota people.
Thanks.
Thank you. The next question is by Jill, and that's, I'm wondering if the seed week that you discussed earlier could be replicated in a respectful way, in different communities.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's a fabulous idea. And in fact, we're having just preliminary conversation in Minneapolis about doing it again, but because we can be in person now. Online was not ideal, but I think replicating that everywhere, or host a powwow. Another dream was to have a seed powwow someday. So if any of you have that capacity and those resources, I would say that would be wonderful to see Seed Week all over the world.
Great. Then question from Carla. With the 3 sisters, what type of squash is grown, and do you plant the seeds at different times?
So the 3 sisters is a little bit tricky. The basic concept is great because it's utilizing the real strengths of each plant to collaborate with each other. But that said, you have to make sure that the corn that you're growing, so they are planted at different times, and so you allow the corn to get established so the squash can grow up, it can vine up. I'm sorry, the beans, the beans vine up the corn, and then the squash creates that layer of shade for the roots. And so the tricky part that I found is that because our seeds often come from different places, they may have different attributes from the ones that were first developed in a Three Sisters garden. So it takes a little trial and error that your corn, squash, and beans are going to be compatible with each other, and that the beans, say, don't overwhelm the corn. And then the timing of it. So I mean, you can experiment, but you can also grow. What I have done more often is grow them in the same garden, but I don't necessarily have the beans twining up the corn, but I will have them in the same area, so that they're in relationship with each other. But you know, it's a little tricky.
Oops. Okay, and I think I had to skip ahead a little bit here. And yeah, I can relate to that, Diane. I put a little note in the chat. In the Haudenosaunee world, there's a bean called Mother Earth bean, and it's really it's great for growing with corn, and it's a very delicate bean, and it won't choke the corn and pull it down, but some of the pole beans do. So
Yeah,
it's like you've got to be so careful about the varieties you choose.
yeah, yeah. So maybe, you know, you have a little experimental corner in your garden where you can try some different varieties together and see how they do.
And how much fun is that too, that
Yeah.
experimentation and that it's yeah.
And that's
Um,
that to me, that's what a lot of gardening is. It is a big science experiment, you know, because every year is different. Not only, I mean, we have different weather, our seeds have evolved another season. And so we always have to come into it as we bring our experience and our knowledge, but it's always kind of starting fresh.
Edible science experiment.
Yes, yes.
So I think there's another question here from Lise. Lise asks, we exist in a changed and changing environment, i.e. climate change as well as GMO contaminated pollen. Do you see any metaphor or practical advice for how we save seeds and keep them pure while also learning how to adapt to the world we currently live in?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So here in Minnesota, this is corn country. So there are 8 million acres of GMO corn that are planted each year. And that means that for any organic grower or small gardener like myself, that our corn that is wind pollinated is at risk of being cross-pollinated by what farmers around us are growing. And in this country, it's illegal for us to have cross-pollinated corn. So that really, if my corn gets cross-pollinated by my neighbor's GMO corn, then I could be sued for having stolen a patented material, which is that is a horrific, horrific way to think about our food system, or to think about plants as something that we patent right there. But at Dream of Wild Health, for example, we had to deal with that reality. We had all these seeds that had to be protected and grown out. And the way that we did it was to hand pollinate, so that at the time when you're getting close to your plant being ready to pollinate, you have to cover the ear with an envelope, and then when the pollen's ready, you would gather it in a bag and you would hand pollinate those ears. And that is very labor intensive, but it was the way that we could come closest to guaranteeing that precious our precious legacy from our ancestors would not be destroyed by GMO pollen. Another practice is to time it. So if you know that your neighbor put their crop in this week, then maybe you wait, and so that you try to time it, and that your crops will not be pollinating at the same time. Windbreaks can help. If you're in a city garden, you know, you're going to have far less to worry about in terms of cross-pollination. And remember that certain plants also, like beans, they self-pollinate. So you can also select what it is you're going to grow. But that is a really important issue. And I think on a, you know, policy level, trying to get as part of this work is establishing a food system in which heirloom seeds and organic crops are protected from cross-pollination from genetically modified foods.
Thank you. You know, I think we just have room for one, maybe one quick question here. Although it might not be a quick question to answer, but the last one I'll be able to have time to read is from Carol. And it's, how do you respectfully remove or manage invasive species of plants that displace indigenous plants and change our plant communities?
You know, I'm dealing with that myself, with a native plant called prickly ash. And so so remembering that there are no weeds, even though I did use that that word earlier, in indigenous languages, there is no such thing as weed. An elder told me once that plants are either food or medicine or utility. So every plant has a purpose. But sometimes those plants get out of balance with each other, especially if there has been disturbance in your area, like my land was overgrazed, and it allowed a very enthusiastic and opportunistic plant to move in. And so if you want to rebalance that system for the overall health of all the plants, then give thanks to the one that is in need of being removed. Just, you can offer a prayer of gratitude, however you do it, but just thank that plant for what they're trying to do in holding the soil in place and simply providing life in an area that needed life. And then you remove it and you return it. You know, some plants can't really be, maybe it has a separate compost, but you know, there's always gratitude that can be expressed towards these plants, and an understanding that we still have a responsibility sometimes as human beings to make sure that an ecosystem is functioning well and remains healthy for all of the plants and animals who are living together.
Wow, thank you. Such a beautiful response. You know, we're at the
And to eat those plants. I noticed a comment in the chat about eating the weeds. Yes, whenever possible, you eat the plants that you pull.
Well, thanks. We've reached the end of our time, and I just want to thank Diane so much for sharing your wonderful thoughts with us today, and to Keith for co-moderating, and thanks to the audience members for sharing your stimulating questions and comments. This program has been one of a series of online events from the Plant Initiative about the human-plant connection, and we're planning another online program on January 30th with plant philosopher Marcello Di Paola about his newly edited book, The Vegetal Turn. We hope you'll join us for that as well. Thanks again for attending today, and we always appreciate support for the Plant Initiative through our website. You know, we have just a couple minutes. Diane, do you want to just see any closing remarks, or Keith, to welcome, you know, to just thank people or say goodbye?
I have one thing I want to say really quickly, and that's just, if you haven't read Diane's book, please do. It's a work of art. It's a beautiful book, and I found it so moving, and I highly recommend it. That's all I want to say. And thank you so much, Diane, for writing that book and for sharing your thoughts with us today.
And I thank you both, Keith and Paul, for the invitation to be here. And I want to thank everyone who has been part of this conversation, and just to encourage you to continue to do the work in your own communities, and just to remember that we're all in this work together. So Pidamaya.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And goodbye, everyone. And thanks again. This will be posted online shortly. And we appreciate your coming and attending today. Thanks again, Diane and Keith. Take
Mhm.
care.